Imagine a world where trust is everything, where the vows you make and the promises you keep form the foundation of your life. Now, imagine that trust being shattered, not by someone from outside your circle, but by the person you thought would never betray you, the one who swore to stand by your side through thick and thin. How do you react when the person you loved, the person who promised to protect you, becomes the very source of your deepest pain? This is the story of a Texas cop, a man of law, duty, and honor, whose life would spiral into chaos because of a decision he made in secret. On the surface, he was the ideal husband, a proud father-to-be, someone you'd expect to be loyal and unwavering. His wife was pregnant, they had a home together, and everything seemed set for the future. Yet, beneath that calm exterior, something was happening that no one could have predicted. A secret affair with two felons, locked away in a Texas prison, would soon unravel everything. But this wasn't just a case of infidelity, it was something much darker, something that would threaten to destroy more than just a marriage. It would put lives at risk, not just his own, but the life of his pregnant wife, and their unborn child. The consequences of his actions would reverberate for years. Lives would be altered forever, and the truth, the painful, horrifying truth, would take years to come to light. At first, it seemed like just another affair, something all too common in the world of high-stress jobs, a man looking for something outside the confines of his everyday life. But in this case, there was more at play, something dangerous. As his affair with the two felons escalated, so did the risk. The cop, unknowingly, had contracted a disease, one that he would then pass to his wife, a woman carrying their child. It wasn't just betrayal, it was something much more insidious. It was a ticking time bomb. What was supposed to be a moment of passion, a fleeting indulgence, would change the course of their lives forever. The cop's hidden affair would turn out to be more than a simple lapse in judgment, it would be the gateway to something catastrophic, something the wife would never see coming. By the time the truth emerged, the damage was already done. Her life was forever altered by the disease that she now carried, something she could never have prepared for. But how did this happen? How did a man whose job was to protect and serve, whose duty it was to uphold the law, become entangled in such a devastating chain of events? What was it about these two felons that drew him in, and why didn't he see the danger of his actions until it was too late? As this story unfolds, you'll discover how one moment of weakness led to a series of choices that would ultimately reveal a truth too horrible to grasp. You'll follow the wife's heart-wrenching journey as she learns of the affair, and then, even worse, learns of the disease that was passed to her. How her own husband had betrayed her in a way no one could have ever imagined. But the story doesn't end there. As the investigation into the cop's actions begins, the real question arises: what happens when the truth starts to emerge, when the public becomes aware, and when the family, who had been the victim of this betrayal, starts to piece together the devastating puzzle? The legal battle, the fight for survival, and the emotional toll, this is where things get even more complicated. The wife must now face a reality she never thought possible, the emotional devastation of being betrayed by the one person she trusted most, coupled with the physical ramifications that threaten her very life and the life of her unborn child. She must come to terms with the harsh reality that her husband, the man she thought she knew, had put everything at risk, and had left her with no choice but to fight for survival. And as for the cop, his life is unraveling, piece by piece, as he faces the consequences of his reckless decisions. What happens when a man who has spent his life serving the law now finds himself at the mercy of that same system? His career, his freedom, and his relationships are all at stake as the truth of his actions spreads like wildfire. But the twist doesn't stop there. As the investigation deepens, new details emerge, and the lives of the two felons who played a pivotal role in this story come to light. Who were they really? How did they manipulate a man of law, and why did the cop trust them in the first place? Their pasts are filled with crime, violence, and deceit, and now, they too will have to face the consequences of their involvement. So, what happens when the truth finally comes to light? Can the damage ever truly be repaired? And who, in the end, will bear the brunt of the consequences for this act of betrayal? As we unfold this shocking tale, you'll discover just how far the ripple effect of one man's choices can go. A cop, a wife, a disease, and a shocking affair. This is a story of love, trust, betrayal, and survival that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about loyalty and justice. Stay with us as we take you through this unimaginable story. Every twist, every revelation, will keep you on the edge of your seat. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on this incredible journey. The truth is coming, prepare for the unexpected. To understand the full impact of the events that followed, it's crucial to first meet the man at the center of this tragic story. A man who, on the surface, appeared to live an ordinary life, one that many would envy. His name was Officer Thomas "Tom" Jameson, a dedicated police officer in a small town in Texas. He wasn't the kind of man who attracted attention for controversy, nor was he someone who would stand out in a crowd. In fact, he fit the mold of what society often considers a hero. A law enforcement officer, protecting and serving his community, a man of duty and honor. But as you will soon see, the life he projected wasn't the life he truly led. Born and raised in the heart of Texas, Tom's upbringing was grounded in the values of hard work and integrity. His family, simple but loving, raised him to believe in doing the right thing. From a young age, he showed an affinity for law enforcement, perhaps inspired by his father, a retired sheriff, who had spent his own life keeping the peace. Tom followed in his father's footsteps and became a police officer, earning the respect of his peers and colleagues. He was a man who could be counted on, someone you could trust. But beyond the badge, Tom was a husband, a man who had recently embarked on the journey of fatherhood. He met Jessica, his wife, in his early 20s. She was everything he had ever wanted, kind, intelligent, and supportive. Their love story had been one of those seemingly perfect tales, the kind you read about in romantic novels. Together, they built a life. They bought a modest home in the suburbs, a few miles from the police station, in a neighborhood filled with families. It was a quiet, peaceful place, where kids played on the street, and neighbors exchanged pleasantries. Tom and Jessica's home was no exception. Jessica was pregnant with their first child. She was glowing, happy, and looking forward to the future. To them, everything was as it should be. There were no signs of trouble on the horizon, no indication that the life they had so carefully crafted together would soon come crashing down. They were excited to be parents, anticipating the birth of their baby with hope and joy. And Tom? He couldn't have been prouder. He'd always dreamed of becoming a father, and now it was happening. They had everything to look forward to. Tom's daily routine was predictable and calm, but far from easy. His shifts at the local police department were long and demanding. As a patrol officer, he was used to the stress and unpredictability of the job. But it wasn't anything he couldn't handle. After a long shift, he would come home to his wife, grab a quick bite, and rest, knowing the next day would bring more of the same. For all intents and purposes, Tom's life seemed to be on track, stable, happy, and uncomplicated. His colleagues at the police department spoke highly of him. He was dependable, a good team player, and well respected in the community. His reputation in town was that of someone you could count on, both on the job and off. It was the kind of life most people would envy. His uniform was polished, his demeanor calm, and his smile warm. To anyone looking in from the outside, Tom's life seemed perfect. He had a stable job, a loving wife, and a bright future ahead with a baby on the way. But beneath this calm and orderly exterior, Tom was struggling in ways that few knew. The pressures of his job were starting to take their toll. Long hours, violent confrontations, and the emotional strain of his work were becoming harder to bear. What Tom didn't realize was that these pressures, combined with the monotony of everyday life, were beginning to eat away at him. There were cracks in the facade, cracks he didn't even notice until it was too late. His marriage, once full of warmth and affection, was beginning to show signs of strain. While Jessica was focused on the pregnancy and their future as a family, Tom began to feel the weight of the choices he had to make. The demands of being a good husband, a supportive father-to-be, and a dedicated officer were beginning to overwhelm him. He had always been the strong one, the protector, but now he was feeling the weight of expectations bearing down on him. Despite the love he had for Jessica and the future they were building, Tom began to question his own happiness. It wasn't that he didn't love her, he did, deeply. But the loneliness of his job, the sense of being misunderstood, and the feeling that his life was becoming a series of monotonous routines began to seep into his mind. It wasn't long before he found himself seeking something he hadn't realized he was missing, an escape. The truth is, Tom's perfect life, his family, his career, all of it, had begun to feel like a cage. A cage he didn't know how to escape from, and yet, he didn't know how to break out of either. In moments of doubt, loneliness, and desperation, he began to question whether his life, this life that everyone else admired, was really what he wanted. In his search for something more, Tom began to make choices that would slowly unravel everything he had worked for. And that's when the affair started, an affair with two men who would forever change his life. But before we go there, let's understand just how deeply he was embedded in his community. Let's look closer at his relationship with Jessica. On the surface, it was perfect, but as you'll soon see, even the best marriages have their breaking points. The question now isn't how everything went wrong, it's how something that seemed so right could fall apart in the blink of an eye. As Tom navigated the demands of his career and family life, he failed to realize how much he was slipping away from everything he had worked to protect. The life he had built with Jessica was slipping through his fingers, and before long, he would find himself making choices that not only threatened his marriage but his very future. It's difficult to pinpoint the exact moment when the cracks in Tom's life began to widen, but we know that when the affair started, everything changed. Tom, like many officers in correctional facilities, had witnessed his fair share of violence, crime, and chaos. Working within the confines of the prison system had its unique challenges: long shifts, isolation, and an overwhelming sense of disconnection from the world outside. The men incarcerated in the Texas prisons weren't just criminals. They were desperate, broken individuals caught in a system that often pushed them into dangerous corners, some of which Tom had the unfortunate duty to monitor. Prison was a world unlike any other, a place where power dynamics were constantly shifting, where authority could easily be undermined by influence and intimidation. As a correctional officer, Tom held a certain position of authority, but within those concrete walls, the inmates often had their own ways of exerting control, whether through manipulation, violence, or cunning. Tom's job had always been to maintain order and ensure the safety of everyone within the prison. Yet, over time, something inside him began to shift. It began with one conversation, one seemingly harmless interaction with a prisoner named Marcus. Marcus was a felon who had spent the majority of his life behind bars. His offenses were numerous: robbery, assault, and drug trafficking. On the surface, he appeared to be just another hardened criminal, but as Tom would soon learn, Marcus had a magnetic charisma that could draw anyone in. He had a way of speaking that made you feel understood, as though he could see beneath the surface of even the most guarded individuals. This was the kind of manipulation that made Marcus stand out in a world of men who were used to being underestimated. It wasn't long before Tom found himself intrigued by Marcus. What began as casual conversations over mundane matters gradually shifted to more personal exchanges. Marcus spoke with Tom about life beyond the prison walls, about freedom, and about how the world outside often turned a blind eye to those incarcerated. He was charismatic, insightful, and somehow, he made Tom question the choices he had made in his own life. Marcus made him feel things that he hadn't felt in years: excitement, curiosity, even a sense of belonging. But Marcus wasn't the only one. There was another man, Nathan, an inmate serving a lengthy sentence for armed robbery and assault. He had a more rugged, unpredictable demeanor, but it was this very unpredictability that kept Tom on edge, intrigued and drawn to him. Nathan didn't say much at first. But when he did speak, his words were direct, cutting through the noise of the prison's daily chaos. He, too, began to build a rapport with Tom, a kind of connection that Tom couldn't quite understand. Stop. At first, Tom didn't recognize what was happening. It wasn't like he set out to form any kind of romantic or sexual connection with either of the men. But the lines between authority and personal connection blurred. He found himself spending more time talking to them, having personal conversations behind closed doors, in the shadows of the prison's hallways. There was something magnetic about the power these men held over him, something he couldn't escape. They began to exploit his vulnerabilities, manipulating him in ways that went unnoticed by Tom until it was too late. The tension was building within him. He was a man sworn to uphold the law, yet here he was, involved in a world of manipulation, desire, and illicit connections. He knew it was wrong. He understood the power imbalance, the risk of it all, but at that moment, the allure of these men and the forbidden nature of their interactions consumed him. These conversations, these small moments of connection, filled a void in Tom that had been growing for months, maybe even years. But it didn't stop at conversations. Slowly, the encounters escalated. The boundaries between officer and prisoner blurred. Marcus and Nathan, both experienced in manipulating the weak points of those in power, recognized Tom's growing internal conflict and, over time, pulled him deeper into their world. In the private, dimly lit rooms of the prison, where even the walls seemed to whisper, Tom and the two men began to cross lines he never thought possible. For Tom, it was an escape from the monotony of his life. An escape from the emotional strain he felt as a husband, as a man who had lost touch with his own desires. The affair, if it could even be called that, wasn't just about sex or lust. It was about power, control, and feeling something he had long since stopped feeling. The adrenaline rush of doing something forbidden, something so wrong yet so irresistible, took hold of him. To make matters worse, the secrecy of it all added to the allure. The entire affair unfolded in the shadowy corridors of the prison, away from the eyes of the law, away from the watchful gaze of his colleagues. These meetings between Tom, Marcus, and Nathan weren't conducted in broad daylight. They were secretive, carefully planned encounters, where the risk was part of the thrill. Behind the prison gates, where danger and betrayal were part of daily life, Tom found a distorted form of connection, a form of release he had never known. But with every secret meeting, the stakes grew higher. Tom had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. The consequences of his actions, hidden beneath the prison's harsh, gray walls, were starting to unravel. He didn't realize it then, but this affair, this dangerous, forbidden relationship, would have ripple effects far beyond the confines of the prison. In a place where manipulation and control were a constant part of daily life, Tom had underestimated just how much power these two men held over him. But as the affair continued, he would soon find that the consequences of his actions, the consequences of these choices, would affect not only his career but his very future. As the affair with Marcus and Nathan continued, Tom remained unaware of the long-lasting, devastating consequences that would come from his actions. The reckless decisions, the secrecy, the moments of forbidden intimacy, they all led to something he never saw coming. At first, everything seemed fine. His health didn't change. He carried on with his work, his family life, and his duties as a police officer, believing that the affair, while wrong, was something he could leave behind. But this wasn't the kind of secret that could remain hidden forever. The silence, the shame, and the weight of his choices were only the beginning. The true cost of his actions would soon begin to take shape in ways far worse than anything he had imagined. It wasn't until several months later, when Tom began to feel physically unwell, that the first signs emerged. His energy waned. He felt a lingering fatigue that wouldn't go away. His body ached, his appetite dwindled, and he started to experience unexplained fever-like symptoms. At first, he brushed it off. After all, he had a demanding job. The long hours, the stress, the violence of the work, he thought it was all just catching up with him. But as the days wore on, the symptoms only worsened. Tom was a man who took care of his health, someone who understood the importance of staying fit and active for his job. Yet, despite his best efforts, the fatigue remained. Eventually, he went to the doctor, unsure of what to expect. The visit, though, would bring news that would change everything. A routine blood test revealed that Tom was HIV positive. The shock hit him hard. HIV? How? He couldn't fathom how this had happened to him. He was careful, he thought he was careful. The idea that a virus, a disease with such far-reaching consequences, could slip into his life without his knowledge felt like a cruel twist of fate. But it didn't take long for the pieces to fall into place. His affair with Marcus and Nathan, both of whom were incarcerated and likely had multiple unprotected sexual encounters, had put him at a higher risk. Tom had unknowingly contracted the virus, a consequence he never anticipated, and it wasn't just his life at risk anymore. He sat alone in the doctor's office, the words echoing in his ears. HIV positive, they repeated in his mind. He left in a daze, not knowing what to do next. There was no way to escape the truth now. The man who had always prided himself on protecting others, the man who had sworn an oath to uphold the law, had allowed his own actions to jeopardize everything. The gravity of the situation crushed him, but even then, he had no idea how far-reaching the damage would be. It wasn't just his life at stake now. It was Jessica's, his pregnant wife's, and the life of their unborn child. In the days that followed, Tom was consumed by guilt and fear. He knew that he had to tell Jessica, but he didn't know how. He wrestled with the shame of what he had done and the terrifying thought that he might have exposed her to a disease that could change her life forever. But no matter how much he tried to rationalize it, the truth remained, he had betrayed her in the most unforgivable way possible. HIV didn't show its symptoms immediately. There was no sudden, obvious indication that something was wrong. Instead, it crept into Tom's life silently. His physical symptoms came in waves, small but persistent. He began to lose weight without explanation, his body seemed to weaken, and his once strong energy vanished completely. But, outwardly, everything seemed normal. The disease hid beneath the surface, growing stronger by the day, with no visible sign to anyone else of the catastrophic path Tom had set into motion. And at this point, he still didn't realize that he had already passed the virus to Jessica. When the symptoms first appeared in Jessica, fatigue, night sweats, and an unusual vulnerability to illness, she thought it was just the stress of pregnancy. After all, being pregnant was hard enough. But Tom, in his guilt, began to fear the worst. He knew he couldn't hide the truth much longer. Jessica Jameson, Tom's wife, was in the midst of one of the most important and vulnerable times of her life. Pregnant with their first child, she was filled with anticipation and joy, eager to welcome their baby into the world. She had dreamed of this moment, building a family with Tom, a life full of love, security, and shared moments. But as her pregnancy progressed, something began to feel off. The vibrant woman who once radiated excitement and energy started to fade. Her glow dimmed, replaced by an unexpected exhaustion that seemed to consume her. She chalked it up to the normal discomforts of pregnancy. After all, every expectant mother faces sleepless nights, bouts of nausea, and fluctuating moods. But as the weeks went on, Jessica couldn't ignore the mounting symptoms that were slowly taking a toll on her body. She felt incredibly fatigued, far more than a pregnant woman should. She was often plagued by night sweats, her body feeling like it was constantly running a low-grade fever. She noticed her appetite waning, her once steady weight gain stalling, and her energy slipping away entirely. But she couldn't understand why. In the quiet moments of the night, when Tom was away on his shifts, Jessica found herself wondering if something was wrong. She tried to ignore it, telling herself it was simply the stress of carrying a child and the natural changes her body was going through. But even her closest friends noticed her decline. A once joyous glow had been replaced with shadows beneath her eyes, a slow burn of worry creeping into her demeanor. At the time, Tom's behavior had also started to shift. He was more distant, distracted, his attention no longer fully on her as it had been when they first learned they were expecting. It was subtle at first. He worked longer hours at the police station, often returning home late, too tired to engage in conversation. When he did come home, he was quiet, withdrawn. And yet, whenever she asked him about his day, about the work he was doing, his answers were short, almost as if he were avoiding her. He would quickly retreat into his routine, leaving her to sit with the growing sense of isolation that she couldn't shake. Jessica brushed off the changes, choosing to believe it was just the strain of both of them preparing for their new lives as parents. She was feeling the pressure, too. There was so much to prepare for, so many things to get done before the baby arrived. But as the weeks wore on, her suspicions deepened. She began to question the sudden physical changes in herself, changes she couldn't explain. The nausea, the weight loss, the constant feeling of being unwell, it just didn't make sense. And then, her fears were confirmed in the most devastating way. It started with a routine checkup at the obstetrician's office. As part of the prenatal care, Jessica's doctor had scheduled a blood test, something typical for expectant mothers, to ensure everything was progressing well. When the test results came back, Jessica's world came to a sudden halt. The doctor's face was solemn as she delivered the news. Jessica had tested positive for HIV. For a moment, time stood still. Jessica's mind went blank. She didn't hear the rest of the doctor's words, didn't process the information as it was being relayed. The room seemed to close in on her. How? How could this be happening? She wasn't reckless, she had trusted her husband with everything, her love, her future, her life. How could she have contracted a disease she had never even considered before? The doctor went on to explain that HIV could be transmitted in several ways, and while the disease wasn't typically passed from mother to child during pregnancy, the news was still alarming. Jessica felt numb, her hands trembling as she tried to grasp what was happening. She left the office in a daze, unable to focus on anything other than the overwhelming truth of what she had just learned. HIV was a life-altering diagnosis. The stigma, the fear, the uncertainty, it was too much to process. As she sat in the car, her thoughts raced. She couldn't understand it. She had been with Tom, and Tom alone. The man she had pledged her life to, the father of her child, the man she trusted above all others, was the only person she had been intimate with. So how could this be happening? There was only one answer, and deep down, she knew it, her husband had betrayed her. She had been exposed to a disease that he must have known about, a disease that, in all likelihood, he had contracted during his secret affair. But Jessica was not ready to face that reality just yet. She still held on to the hope that perhaps there had been a mistake, a misdiagnosis. Maybe the test results had been wrong. She went to another doctor for a second opinion, but the results came back the same. HIV positive. The reality sank in like a heavy stone, settling deep in her chest, and the crushing truth became undeniable. Her husband had given her this disease. The man she loved, the man she had trusted, had caused this pain. Her emotions were a whirlwind of disbelief, hurt, and anger. She didn't know how to confront him. She didn't know how to even begin to understand how this had happened. How could she have been so blind? How could she have missed the signs, the distance, the change in Tom's behavior? She thought their relationship was solid, built on love and respect, but now it felt like everything was a lie. She needed answers. But how could she confront Tom without tearing apart the very fabric of their lives? How could she even begin to wrap her mind around the fact that her husband, the father of her child, had betrayed her so completely? As Jessica wrestled with the painful truth, she started to question everything, her marriage, her trust, her future. The weight of it all threatened to consume her. She had to tell Tom. She had to face him. The man who had once been her rock had now become the source of her deepest pain and fear. Jessica was on the verge of losing everything. The man she loved, the life they had planned together, and the future of their unborn child. And as she walked towards the inevitable confrontation with Tom, she couldn't shake the feeling that nothing would ever be the same again. She was about to discover the truth that would change her life forever, and the life of their baby. The moment Jessica walked into their home that evening, everything changed. The weight of the diagnosis still hung over her like a suffocating cloud, but now, she had one singular goal: answers. Her thoughts were a storm of questions. How could he do this to her? How could he betray her and their unborn child? She needed to confront him. She needed to know how far his deception had gone. She found Tom in the kitchen, his back turned to her as he prepped dinner, something they had always done together, a quiet moment of connection after a long day. But this time, there was no warmth in the scene, no familiarity. Just a coldness that filled the room as Jessica stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the man she once trusted. Her heart raced, her palms sweating as she gripped the doorframe. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself before she spoke, but the words that came out were sharper than she could have imagined. "I know." The words seemed to hang in the air, thick with anger and pain. Tom turned around, his face pale, his eyes widening. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The silence was deafening. Jessica's voice cracked as she continued, her emotions spilling out uncontrollably. "How could you do this to me? To us? I'm carrying your child, and you." She couldn't finish the sentence. The tears were coming now, unbidden and fierce. Her heart was broken, and in that moment, she knew everything had changed. This wasn't just about betrayal, it was about her health, her life, and the future of their child, all hanging in the balance. Tom stood there, unable to speak, his guilt overwhelming him. He had no defense, no justification for what he had done. He had been caught in the act of his own lies, exposed for the man he truly was. His affair, his deception, had put everything he loved at risk, and now, the woman who had once been his rock, the woman who had trusted him unconditionally, was standing before him, crushed by the weight of his actions. He had thought he could keep it hidden, that the secret would never come to light. But now, there was no escape. The truth was out, and the consequences were too great to ignore. "I never meant for this to happen," he said weakly, but the words were hollow. There was no way to undo what had already been done. No way to fix what was broken. Jessica, through her sobs, demanded the truth. "Who are they? Who are these men? And how long has this been going on? How long were you lying to me?" Her voice trembled with each question, each one cutting deeper than the last. The weight of Tom's betrayal was not just emotional, it was physical, too. The HIV diagnosis hung over them like a looming shadow. Tom's affair with Marcus and Nathan had led to more than just broken trust, it had led to a life-altering disease being passed to his wife. He had put her life, and their unborn child's life, at risk without a second thought. It was an act of selfishness that Tom couldn't deny. And for Jessica, the consequences were more than just a broken heart, they were an existential crisis. The fear of the disease was terrifying. Would she live? Would the baby be healthy? What kind of future would they have now, knowing that HIV would be a part of their lives forever? But the emotional toll on Jessica was far deeper than the diagnosis alone. She was forced to wrestle with the feeling of profound betrayal. The man she had loved and trusted had turned into someone unrecognizable. Their shared dreams, the family they had planned for, seemed to slip away like sand through her fingers. The life they had built was shattered, replaced with the crushing weight of truth and consequence. Tom was spiraling too. He had to face the brutal truth, his actions had put not only his career and reputation at risk, but also the life of the woman he claimed to love. His shame was palpable, but what haunted him more than anything was the fact that he had put Jessica's life in jeopardy. He couldn't undo the damage. He couldn't take back the choices he had made. Tom's confession wasn't easy. It came in fragmented pieces, each one more difficult than the last. He had betrayed her, lied to her, and worst of all, he had put her in harm's way. The weight of his betrayal was beyond words. Jessica stood there, her body trembling, her face a mask of disbelief and hurt. She couldn't comprehend it. She couldn't understand how the man she had trusted most had destroyed everything they had built together. And then, the painful realization hit her: the future they had once dreamed of was uncertain. Their child, her pregnancy, was now overshadowed by the disease Tom had unknowingly brought into their lives. HIV was a lifelong, incurable illness. The idea of having to manage it, of living with it day in and day out, was terrifying. Jessica had to face not just the emotional fallout of Tom's betrayal but the physical and psychological trauma of being infected with a disease she never expected to contract. She was forced to confront her worst fears: what would happen to her and her baby? Would she survive this? Could their family survive this? And as for Tom, could their marriage survive the depths of this betrayal, or had he forever destroyed the bond they had shared? The physical and emotional fallout of this betrayal would affect them for years to come. There was no easy resolution, no quick fix. The aftermath of Tom's affair had altered the trajectory of their lives, leaving them to grapple with a future that would never be the same. Tom, a man who had once been a figure of authority and respect, now stood before the woman he loved, broken and remorseful. But no amount of guilt or regret could undo the damage that had been done. Jessica was left to pick up the pieces, unsure of where to go or how to move forward. The journey ahead was uncertain, filled with questions and fears. But one thing was clear: the trust that had once defined their marriage was gone. And for Jessica, the question now was not just how to heal, but whether healing was even possible after the explosive consequences of Tom's actions. Stay with us as we continue to unravel this heartbreaking story of betrayal, illness, and the fight for survival. As the shocking details of Tom Jameson's affair with two felons emerged, the consequences of his actions rippled out far beyond the emotional turmoil within his home. While the destruction of his marriage and his family's future was devastating, the legal consequences of his betrayal were equally significant, and far-reaching. The question that loomed over everyone involved was simple yet profoundly complex: who was to blame for the chain of events that led to the transmission of HIV, and how would the legal system address these serious violations? The investigation into Tom's actions began as soon as Jessica's HIV diagnosis was confirmed. The authorities had to understand the full scope of the situation. Was this a case of deliberate misconduct? Or was it the result of reckless behavior in an affair that spiraled out of control? As details began to unfold, a more troubling picture emerged. Tom's affair wasn't just a personal betrayal, it was a legal issue that required law enforcement's intervention. Jessica's diagnosis was the catalyst for the investigation, but it wasn't long before it became clear that HIV transmission wasn't just a side effect of Tom's affair, it was the focal point of the crime. The law was clear: knowingly transmitting HIV to another person without their consent was a criminal act. Texas law, like many states, made it a felony offense to knowingly expose someone to a life-threatening disease like HIV. For Tom, the consequences were severe. As law enforcement began their inquiry, they quickly focused on Tom's relationship with Marcus and Nathan, the two felons involved. Marcus, a career criminal with a history of violent offenses, and Nathan, a man convicted of armed robbery and assault, had both been incarcerated in the same facility where Tom had worked as a correctional officer. During the investigation, it was revealed that Marcus and Nathan were well aware of the power they had over Tom, men who had learned how to manipulate others for their gain. But it wasn't just their manipulation that would bring them into the legal spotlight. The fact that they, too, were aware of their HIV-positive statuses added another layer of complexity to the case. As law enforcement looked into Marcus and Nathan's past, it became clear that both men had a history of reckless behavior, including multiple sexual encounters with other inmates. They had knowingly exposed others to the virus during their time behind bars. The authorities immediately recognized that the two men's actions were not only harmful but criminal, as they had put Tom at risk without any regard for his safety. But the larger question was whether they had any responsibility in transmitting the virus to Jessica. The investigation centered around whether or not Marcus and Nathan could be held accountable for the transmission of HIV to Jessica, especially since Tom had unknowingly contracted the virus through his encounters with them. Were they criminally liable for passing the disease on to an uninformed third party? The authorities would have to navigate the legal boundaries of HIV transmission, consent, and negligence. Meanwhile, public reaction to the case was intense. The media, always eager to highlight stories of betrayal, focused heavily on the shocking nature of the affair and the resulting HIV transmission. News outlets around the country picked up the story, reluctantly mixing the elements of scandal and the raw, emotional devastation that Jessica was now facing. The public was divided. Some sympathized with Jessica, seeing her as a victim of Tom's recklessness, while others found themselves shocked by the involvement of the felons in the case. Many people began to question how the legal system could address such a complex issue of disease transmission and accountability. The legal system, in turn, had to grapple with new questions. Should Tom face criminal charges for exposing Jessica to HIV? Could Marcus and Nathan be held accountable for their role in the transmission of the disease? In Texas, the law stipulated that an individual could be charged with a criminal offense for knowingly exposing another person to HIV without their consent. In Tom's case, it was clear that his actions were reckless. He had failed to disclose his HIV status to Jessica, and he had knowingly exposed her to the virus through his affair. However, prosecutors had to decide whether or not they could prove his intent. Did Tom's affair constitute a criminal act of intentional exposure, or was it merely the result of negligent behavior? Despite the complexity of the case, the prosecutor's office moved forward with charges against Tom for criminal HIV exposure. His failure to disclose his status and his involvement in knowingly transmitting the disease to his wife, who had no idea of the risks involved, were considered sufficient grounds for criminal charges. Tom was arrested and charged with a felony count of criminal exposure to HIV, which carried a significant prison sentence. The legal system, it seemed, was ready to hold him accountable for the consequences of his reckless decisions. Marcus and Nathan, too, faced their own legal consequences. While they were already serving prison sentences for their previous crimes, the authorities added new charges against them related to the reckless endangerment of others through their actions. The felons, who had knowingly exposed others to HIV, were held accountable for their part in spreading the virus. In many ways, their sentences became part of a larger conversation about the responsibilities of those who knew their HIV status and the legal implications of exposing others to a life-threatening disease. As the legal proceedings continued, the ripple effect of this story became undeniable. It wasn't just about the broken trust between a husband and wife. It was about accountability, about understanding the power and responsibility each individual has when it comes to their actions and the lives of others. And in the end, the court of law would determine just how far the consequences of betrayal would stretch. As the legal proceedings against Tom continued, Jessica Jameson found herself standing at the crossroads of her life. What had once been a future full of promise, a family, a child, a partnership, was now marked by betrayal, fear, and uncertainty. The journey ahead would require more than just confronting the man who had shattered her life. It would demand that she confront herself, her sense of identity, and the future she had hoped for. No longer the woman who trusted her husband with everything, Jessica had to become something else, something stronger, someone who would fight not only for justice but for her own survival. The first and most immediate challenge was her health. Her HIV diagnosis was no longer just a painful, shocking truth, it was now a reality she had to live with. Medical appointments became a regular part of her routine. The constant tests, the treatment regimens, the fear of what the future might hold, it all weighed heavily on her. There were days when the emotional and physical toll seemed almost unbearable. But Jessica refused to let the disease define her. She began working closely with doctors, learning everything she could about HIV and how to protect her health. She was determined not to let this virus destroy her life, her ability to be a mother, or her ability to love again. This was not the life she had chosen for herself, but it was the life she had now, and Jessica wasn't going to let it break her. One of the first decisions she made was to begin therapy, seeking professional support to navigate the overwhelming mix of emotions she was facing. Anger, grief, confusion, and fear were all consuming. How could she process the immense betrayal while also caring for her unborn child? How could she forgive herself for not seeing the signs of Tom's infidelity? Therapy gave her the space she needed to work through her complex emotions and begin the slow, painful process of healing. In the midst of this internal turmoil, Jessica made the brave decision to take control of her own future. She hired a lawyer and began to pursue a civil suit against Tom. She sought justice, not just for the betrayal he had inflicted upon her but for the harm that had been done to her health and the future of their child. As part of her legal strategy, she also explored the possibility of suing Marcus and Nathan, the felons who had played a role in exposing her to HIV. She would not let them escape accountability for their part in this nightmare. But it wasn't just the legal fight that gave Jessica the strength to push forward, it was her commitment to her child. The life growing inside her became her reason to fight, her reason to stay strong. Every moment of discomfort, every difficult test result, every moment of doubt became part of a larger narrative, her journey to protect her child, to ensure that despite the circumstances of her pregnancy, her baby would be born with love and care. She couldn't change the past, but she could shape her future, and the future of her child. As the weeks passed, Jessica's strength began to grow. She had moments of self-doubt, of course, but the quiet resilience inside her started to blossom. Every time she woke up feeling sick or exhausted, she reminded herself that she was doing this for her child. She wasn't just fighting for her health, she was fighting for the life she wanted to give to her baby. She imagined the day she would hold her child in her arms, and that image kept her moving forward. Jessica began to transform in ways she never expected. She took control of her narrative, refusing to let her husband's betrayal or her diagnosis define her. She focused on what she could do to ensure a brighter future for herself and her child. She found strength in her vulnerability, realizing that the act of seeking help, of asking for support, was not a weakness but a form of empowerment. But despite all of her efforts to regain control, the emotional toll on Jessica was still immense. She struggled with feelings of inadequacy, guilt, and anger. How could Tom, the father of her child, have put them both in such a devastating situation? The emotional weight of being betrayed by someone she had loved so deeply was something she could never fully escape. But as she worked through her anger and fear, she started to realize that healing wouldn't come from holding on to that rage, it would come from finding forgiveness, not for Tom, but for herself. With each passing day, Jessica came to terms with the fact that she could not change the past. She could not undo the betrayal, nor could she erase the pain caused by Tom's actions. But she could choose how to move forward. She could build a future for herself and her child that was defined not by the man who had hurt her but by the woman she was becoming. Jessica's journey was not one of simple closure. It wasn't about an easy, happy ending or an overnight resolution. It was a process, an ongoing battle to reclaim her life and her sense of self. She understood now that redemption wasn't about forgiving Tom, it was about finding peace within herself. It was about learning that, even in the face of unimaginable betrayal, she had the power to heal. As Jessica neared the end of her pregnancy, she faced her future with cautious optimism. The road had been long and painful, but she had emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to create a life filled with love and strength, for herself and for her child. Jessica's journey was one of survival, resilience, and, ultimately, redemption. A story not just of a woman betrayed, but of a mother who fought with everything she had to rebuild a future worth living for. As Tom sat in his prison cell, he was forced to reckon with the gravity of his actions. There was no escaping the truth: he had destroyed the life he had once built. The badge he had worn with pride no longer meant anything, the trust of his colleagues was gone, his family shattered. For a man who had lived his life in service of the law, the irony was painfully clear: he had violated the very principles he had sworn to uphold. The officer's downfall was not just a loss of career, it was the loss of everything that had once defined him. For Tom Jameson, there would be no redemption in the traditional sense. The prison sentence he faced was a reflection of the severity of his crimes, but there was no easy path to redemption. No matter how much he regretted his actions, no matter how deeply he wished he could go back and undo the damage, the reality remained: he had irrevocably changed the course of his life and the lives of those he loved. In the quiet of his cell, Tom had time to reflect on the man he had become. The power dynamics he had allowed to influence his choices, the manipulation he had succumbed to, and the reckless behavior that had led to such disastrous consequences were all things he had to face in solitude. It was too late to change the past, and too late to seek the forgiveness he so desperately wanted. His fate was sealed. And though the years in prison would eventually pass, the emotional scars, on him, on Jessica, and on their unborn child, would never truly fade. As the story of Tom and Jessica Jameson comes to a close, we are left to reflect on the complexity of what unfolded, how a single mistake, a single lapse in judgment, has forever altered the course of so many lives. Tom, a man sworn to uphold justice, betrayed the very trust he had built his life on. He didn't just destroy his own career, he endangered the health of the woman he had promised to protect, and unknowingly passed on a life-threatening disease that would affect their unborn child. His affair, which may have started as a momentary lapse, spiraled into a tragedy with irreversible consequences. But the damage didn't stop with Tom. The emotional fallout for Jessica was profound. The life she had carefully built, the love she had trusted, was upended in a matter of months. She faced not only the devastation of betrayal but the fear and uncertainty of a future now dominated by a disease that threatened her very existence and that of her child. Yet, Jessica's story is one of remarkable strength and resilience. She fought, not only to survive but to rebuild herself, to protect her child, to find justice, and, ultimately, to find peace with the pieces of her broken life. Her journey was never going to be easy. There were days when she doubted herself, when the pain of betrayal and the fear of her diagnosis threatened to consume her. But through it all, Jessica found a way forward. She sought justice in the courts, and though the legal process was long and painful, she came to understand that justice wasn't just about retribution, it was about taking control of her future, protecting her child, and reclaiming her sense of self. And then there's Tom, the officer who once stood as a pillar of authority, now reduced to a man in a prison cell, forced to reckon with the consequences of his choices. For him, redemption will be a long, difficult road. His career, his marriage, his freedom, all gone. His actions, while driven by personal demons and poor decisions, left a lasting imprint on the lives of those he once loved. Whether or not he will ever be able to redeem himself is uncertain. The question remains, can he ever truly atone for what he's done, or has his fate been sealed by the weight of his own actions? As we conclude this tragic, yet ultimately redemptive story, we are left with questions about the fragility of trust and the long-lasting impact of betrayal. The ripple effects of Tom Jameson's choices will be felt for years to come, not only by him, but by everyone he hurt along the way. But perhaps there is also a deeper lesson here, a reminder of the importance of accountability. When we make choices that affect others, we must face the consequences. There is no escaping the damage that can be done when trust is broken, when our actions harm those we love. But there is also power in taking responsibility, in seeking redemption, and in rebuilding what has been lost. As we look back at this tragic, shocking story, we're reminded of how lives can be altered in the blink of an eye, and the deep, irreversible impact of betrayal and disease. It forces us to reflect on our own lives, our own choices, and how we can protect the people we love. Because in the end, the things we do to others often return to us in ways we could never foresee. Thank you for joining us in this powerful, heartbreaking journey. We hope this story has made you reflect on the choices you make and the lives they touch. Please like, subscribe, and share if you feel this story is important, because the lessons here are ones that we can all learn from. And as always, we'll be back with more true crime stories that make us think, question, and understand the complexities of life, love, and the choices that define us. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay compassionate, and stay aware.